Story 1. Why I Will Never Hitchhike Again. This happened to me about 8 years ago. I had hitchhiked regularly for more than 2 years. This was the last time I ever did. When you hitchhike overnight, there are two options. Either someone offers you a place to stay, or you find yourself a place to crawl into. I always had my one-man tent and a light sleeping bag with me, but I rarely needed them. I'm a rather talkative and friendly guy, and usually those people that are ready to let a single young man in their car and enjoy his company don't mind offering said man a bed, or at least a corner in the garage at night, and a shower in the morning. I had been on the road for 6 days, and every single night I was lucky enough to score a bed. The second night I had even been invited to come along to a house party. The third night I was offered to join some sort of family reunion where a father met his kids for the first time in years. But I politely refused because his ex-wife obviously minded having a smelly stranger around. In return for being polite, I got a beer and a pack of yogurt and was allowed to sleep in the car. I think when you hitchhike, it's best not to have a fixed schedule or route. It is much more pleasant to follow whatever recommendations the locals give and drift day by day, just a bit closer to your destination. Hitchhiking is not really a way of traveling. I think it's more a way of thinking, away from get from here to there, thinking towards a more zen-like, the journey is the reward mentality. Still, those 6 days, I got pretty far. I hadn't tried very hard, but I had managed to get about 2/3 of the way to my uncle's place. I started on Monday, had 6 days of luck, and just when God was getting ready for his day off, my luck disappeared. An older lady took me off the highway and dropped me at a rather desolate country road. There were still cars driving, but the sun was getting ready to kiss the horizon. If there's something you learn as a hitchhiker, it's that when dawn comes no one trusts strangers anymore. No one trusts the lone, unkempt man that stands at the side of the road waiting for a ride. And if you are a lone, unkempt woman standing at the side of the road, you better don't trust those cars that stop for you. After half an hour of sticking my thumb in the direction of approaching cars, I realized there was barely a chance to get a ride, and certainly no chance at all to get a bed. I started walking off the road and towards a small forest. It's never good to sleep in the open. The police will bother you, or else drunk strangers might. Forests also give you cover in case you have to do your business, and they keep wind and rain away. In general, when my tent is in a forest, I sleep better than when it is at the side of a street. I had set up the tent and gathered wood for a small fire. My camp was just a few steps from the meadow that bordered the forest, not too deep inside the woods. I settled down, hummed a song to myself, and tried to read with my flashlight as the light source. The wood was too wet, and the fire produced more smoke than warmth. I had read 3 pages when I heard heavy steps somewhere behind me. Branches breaking. Heavy, soft steps. Bare. I was up on my feet with the flashlight in the left and a thick stick in the right hand. The flashlight was not able to reach far, and all I could see were trees. I stood and listened for 5 or 10 minutes. The light flashed from tree to tree, but the steps had stopped. Shouting keeps them away. Shout with a loud and deep voice, and they will keep their distance. You want to seem like a big animal. I shouted from the depth of my lungs. Instantly, the steps returned. They were louder, heavier, faster. They came towards me from somewhere to the left. My flashlight searched for the source, but wherever I shone was nothing. Suddenly, I saw the large brown body moving towards me. It flicked from one side to the other, rushed through the trees. The huge stag jumped out so close to me that I felt the warm air of its body brush against my arm. It ran past my tent. Seconds later, he had disappeared again between the trees. The footsteps faded into the distance. For a few more minutes, I searched the area where the stag had come. I wondered whether it was my shout that upset it, or whether there might have been something else. With the flashlight in my hand and the stick at my side, I tried to read the book again. This time my back leaned against the tent. I read a page, then read it again. Even when I read the page for a third time, the words still refuse to stay in my head. I gave up. I left my small collection of food in a plastic bag outside the tent. Then I myself crawled inside, pulled the zipper shut, made sure the knife was at my side and closed my eyes. Nightmares. The whole night. Just nightmares. Nightmares of someone chasing me. Nightmares of someone catching me. Nightmares of someone cutting me open. Nightmares that ended with my death. But each time the imaginary world turned black, I sank right into the next imaginary forest, right into the next chase. I woke up at 5 a.m. Birds were already singing, and through the thin plastic of the tent I saw the first morning light. The uneven floor of the tent was uncomfortable. There were cold, hard lumps of soil under the plastic, but I was sure that I had cleared the space before I had set up the tent. For about half an hour I tried to sleep. There was a stirring outside the tent, some animal rummaging through the underwoods and shaking leaves. Something struck the tent. A loud, roaring moan. I sat up and slowly opened my pocket knife. The movement continued, more vigorously and loudly. Something repeatedly hit the ground. I was too focused on the stirring outside. I didn't notice the movement under the tent's floor until a dent grew right next to my leg. The dent in the plastic rose from the floor to nearly the height of my leg. I pulled my leg away. The dent stopped, shrunk a bit, and moved slowly under the plastic to my other leg. I quickly pulled my leg away, pulled the zipper of the tent open, and crawled out. There was a fawn on the floor right next to my food bag. Its head was in my direction. It made a faint huffing noise. I hesitated. I didn't want to get attacked by a deer for approaching its fawn. The fawn struggled to get up. I looked around but couldn't see its mother. I got on my feet to sneak away. I saw why the fawn was struggling. There were hands around its neck. 2 human hands with greyish skin. The hairy and dirty arms came right out of the ground. The fawn moaned. There was another hand holding its hind legs. The tent shook slightly. Just slightly, but enough to make me understand. I jumped away just before the hand appeared from under the tent. It brushed my heel, but I had jumped just in time to escape. The fawn kicked again and tried to get up. The hand that had attacked me disappeared under the soil. I saw the ground moving slightly, like 2 snakes under a black sheet moving in my direction. I ran past the fawn to get back out of the forest. I rushed through the trees and back onto the meadow. Then I ran to the street. Only in my shorts I waved to passing cars, but they all just drove by until I finally stood in the middle of the street. A large black car stopped in the distance. I ran towards it. The driver called the police. I'm not sure whether he did it because I begged him to do it, or because a screaming half-naked man jumped up and down in front of his car. I explained what I saw, but I doubt that they believed me. The officers walked with me back to the forest. The fawn's body was ripped into pieces. Part of its leg was pulled into the ground. The neck was clearly broken. The hands were gone. The officers said I would have to come with them. I asked to at least pack my belongings. They watched while I packed my sleeping bag and finally my tent. When I folded the tent, one of the officers gasped. He pointed to a small hole right below my tent. Inside the hole was a round, soft shape, a greyish object. It looked like a branch, if not for the wrist. They unearthed 3 bodies. They had all been cut open. I read the news articles. The people were identified as hitchhikers. 2 of them disappeared a year earlier, the other one 2 years before that. Still, their bodies were in perfect condition. Some expert was quoted that the moist and clay-like soil preserved the bodies so well. As a witness, I had to stay in town for a week. The police paid the hotel for me. I was called in twice for questioning. The first time was on the day after my find, on Monday. On Monday they only asked what I had seen, and when I described the hands coming from the ground, they told me not to invent supernatural stories. My story was dismissed as some sort of vivid nightmare. Their psychiatrists suggested that I must have seen or smelled the bodies, and that my mind created the rest of the story to warn me. On Friday they asked me to come a second time. On Friday they were suddenly very interested to hear my other stories. They wanted to know the details of what I had seen. This time, when I described the hands and how they held the fawn and tried to grab my leg, they didn't stop me. They didn't doubt me. They didn't say it was just a nightmare. They just nodded and wrote it down. Afterwards, I talked to one of the officers. I asked him whether they had any hints as to what had happened. He said that they don't know and that they likely will never figure it out. He said the whole situation was weird. He said that it was odd that the bodies should have been rotten but were still in good condition. And, he said, there was fresh meat in their stomachs. Story 2. In the 90s, I picked up a hitchhiker who won't leave me alone. I was traveling through Eastern Europe at the time and heard about a curse involving a hitchhiker on an abandoned road. I was the kind of person who ran towards shit like that. I wish I hadn't. The road was on the outskirts of a town, and the locals gave me a good warning about it. The warning was simple. Once the sun drops, don't drive down Zavodska RD. I asked if that was because of looters or gangs or punk kids. But the locals said, no, it was because of the curse of Avtostopnik, which is Ukrainian for the hitcher. They warned me to not just think about myself, but also my friends and family. I was curious, but lied and said I'd take their warnings. That night, I went for a drive to Zavodska RD. On the map, it showed the road started and finished with dead ends that had offshoots left and right. Zavodska was 6 kilometers long, but a straight line distance between its beginning and end was only 1 kilometer. The road curved and swirled so much it made the length of the trip 6 times longer. I arrived at the offshoot that led onto Zavodska. The entrance looked like every other quiet country road I'd passed to get here. But this road was separating 2 sets of forests which grew thicker and canopied overhead the further you went. I turned onto Zavodska and drove 30 feet before the road curved off to the right. It turned sharply, right again, left again, and before I knew it, I lost all sense of direction. I drove slow, taking my time as I followed the winding road through the thickening woods. After 5 minutes, I came out the other side and Zavodska ended. Either I could go left or right, but Zavodska Road was done. The locals said that driving down the road was like playing Russian roulette. People mostly got lucky and the curse wouldn't materialize. But sometimes, if you turned your headlights off for a minute while driving then turned them back on, it would cause the curse to manifest. I flicked off my headlights and slowly re-entered Zavodska. Without my lights, I was just barely able to see 5 feet ahead. A minute passed. Then 2. I turned my lights back on and immediately saw something ahead. A figure was standing to the right of the road. Its arm was out, thumb up in a hitchhiking position. I drove closer and made out the details of the figure. It was a man. A homeless vagrant wearing a priest's outfit with a dirty collar. His hair was dark and wild, and his eyes were demented. His face was covered in bloody wrinkles. I couldn't tell if he was smiling or screaming. Within seconds of seeing him, I'd sweat through all my clothes. I pushed the gas down to speed by him, but it had the opposite effect. The car slowed. I slammed the gas pedal, stomped it, kicked it, but the car crept along, idling up next to the hitcher. The hitcher came right up to the window, pressing his bloody, wrinkled face against it. His smile pushed through the glass without breaking it, and I felt his cold breath on my face. His eyes shimmered like a cat's with an orange glow. At this point I'd realized, somehow, I'd confused the gas pedal with the brakes and switched my feet. I hit the actual gas and peeled away, leaving a bloody wrinkle smear across the passenger side window. I whipped around the next corner, and the hitcher disappeared from my rear view. But he reappeared 3 more times along the side of the road, as I tried to get off Zavodska. Finally, I reached the entrance and got onto the next road. And the next. And before I knew it, I was back in the village. I went to my hotel, got my things and cut my Vokri short. The next day, I was on a flight back home. But I kept seeing him. It wasn't often, but sometimes when I'd drive at night, I'd see the hitcher on the side of the road. He started off with just a smile and a wave. Then he started running out into the street to get in front of my car. Then he started trying to jump on the car. I was always alone, so I could never ask anyone if they saw him. I couldn't tell if it was all in my head or real. I never saw him when I was walking, so the small amount of time I actually spent in a car went to nearly zero. I rarely traveled in cars or buses or any forms of road transit. I basically walked everywhere. But I stopped driving or riding in transit altogether 2 years after I drove down Zavodska. I was DDing my friend Jamie home from a dinner party when I saw the hitcher in the middle of the road. I swerved to avoid him and figured Jamie thought I was crazy. But Jamie saw the hitcher too. He described the hitcher's priest-like outfit and wondered why he was in the middle of the road, raging at me. I wasn't sure if it felt better knowing that someone else could see the hitcher, or worse knowing that the hitcher had followed me home from Zavodska and was, in fact, real. A week later, Jamie called me and told me he'd seen the hitcher again when he was out for a drive with his wife. She'd seen him too. A few days after, they both died in a freak car accident. I haven't stepped in a car again since. But last week, I rode the city bus for the first time in years, and the second stop after I got on, I saw him, the hitcher. He was on the side of the road, and he had my friend Jamie with him, and Jamie's wife, who were both badly decomposed, but not dead. I could see them weakly struggling, but they were being held up by the back of their necks by the hitcher, who was in complete control. The hitcher made the 2 bodies move around like grotesque ventriloquist dummies, as he himself laughed and danced. We drove past the spectacle, and I realized everyone on the bus was staring at the hitcher too. Story 3. Don't wander the Navajo Nation at night. The name is Alex. It's a generic white boy name, I'm aware, but I was actually born and raised in a small town called Chinle. Chinle is nestled deep in the arid mountains of the northeast Navajo Nation, in the northeast corner of Arizona. While many Arizonan small towns embody some sort of nostalgic Americana feel, this cannot be said for any town on the reservation. The reservation, Chinle included, was rife with poverty, alcoholism, abuse, and social isolation. It's the closest you can get to hell within the United States. So, perhaps it isn't any wonder that after buying vodka from a friend at the age of 16, I was merely wandering the outskirts of the town, taking swigs of vodka. My father was abusive, my mother dead. I had no real reason to return home for the night, nor did my father have any reason to care if I returned. I had a bottle of vodka in one hand, and a gun in my jacket pocket in the off chance some shit went down, as it tends to on the res. The night would have been memorable even without my petrifying and life-changing experience, as it was a frigid March night, temperatures below freezing. A light dusting of snow was falling from the pitch-dark night sky. That's the one benefit of the Navajo Nation's clear night skies, but it's truly akin to finding one diamond in 50 acres of shit. I walked in a lackadaisical fashion alongside a 2-lane road, a rural road on which few ever drove. I heard rustling noises in the bushes to the left, and spotted a coyote. I shrugged it off. I'd had dozens of encounters with coyotes in my life. I had no reason to fear it. I took another swig of vodka and continued walking, hoping I could reach the state line by 1 a.m. The crisp night air seemed to accelerate into a much more frigid, windy atmosphere. Something felt off. Something felt deeply ominous in an unsettling way. I glanced to my left again. The coyote, which must have been 25 yards from me prior, was now about 10 yards away from me, and slowly walking my direction. Perhaps it's hostile, I thought to myself. Regardless, I remained largely apathetic, though I'd be lying if I said I didn't have a modicum of fear at this point. 30 seconds later, I'm still walking down the road. The coyote is within 30 feet of me, keeping pace with me. It didn't seem outwardly hostile from a cursory glance. It just appeared as if it was following me, as if I had a nice slab of steak in my back pocket. I kept an eye turned to the coyote. I was growing deeply concerned. A drop of icy sweat dripped past my brow. The wind only grew stronger and the coyote closer. I considered my options, and quickly realized that I could get fucked over if I didn't act. Seeing as I was the track star of the Chinley High School, prior to my expulsion, I leaped forward at a rapid pace and simply ran for it. I bolted. I hauled ass. I sprinted. The coyote remained walking momentarily, as if he didn't want to bother some drunken teenager sprinting through a frigid desert. Then the coyote rapidly picked up his pace, and within seconds was a mere few feet behind me. The facade of passiveness in the coyote's eyes had vanished. I saw pure hatred. I swore its eyes were yellow. I swear it. I had never seen anything like it in my life. Absolutely frightened, I smashed the bottle of vodka across its skull when it came no more than a foot behind me. While the coyote was wounded, I wasn't fucking around. I continued running. I paused for a second, and continued running. The glass was easily lodged within the coyote's head. I looked back and saw a pool of blood formulating on the icy road. I looked forward, then again looked back and did a double take. The coyote no longer had a wound on its head, and it was again running full force towards me. So, I did something that is completely illegal on the reservation, something worse than bootlegging alcohol at the age of 16. I pulled out my grandfather's old pistol I carried and fired a shot. I missed. I tried again. Missed again. The coyote is again feet behind me, snarling something violent, as if it's trying to communicate. The ominous silence had vanished. The coyote was enraged and inhuman. A third shot. This time it landed in the coyote's head yet again. Wounded. Yet again. And you better believe I didn't stop to celebrate. I had seen what this bastard was capable of. I dropped my pistol and ran. Then I saw the headlights. Headlights. I frantically stood in the middle of the road, motioning towards the oncoming car, attempting to stop him. Most Navajo don't pick up hitchhikers for safety precautions, so I was going to force this guy to let me in. Within 10 seconds, the man driving the vehicle came to a screeching halt, almost slipping on the black ice. I stood by the passenger door, and he reluctantly rolled down his window. Let me in. A fucking coyote is chasing me. I'm not a delinquent, I swear. Please, sir, trust me. He simply nodded his head and let me inside the vehicle. He must have been drunk, I figured. As I took deep, long breaths as I buckled my seatbelt, I gazed into the rearview mirror of the automobile, driven by a silent, drunk Navajo man. The coyote was running behind us, easily going faster than 30 miles per hour. Maybe 40 miles per hour. The man took notice of this and began speeding up. "Kid, is this what chased you?" he said in an incomprehensible slur. That's when it hit me. This wasn't a coyote. The faster it ran, I began to see it. Antlers. A pelt on its head. Wait. His head. The four-legged creature was now on its hind legs. Wait, no, where did his other two legs go? The driver glanced at me and locked eyes with me. Skinwalker, he said calmly. That is a skinwalker. I will drive fast now, he said. 60 miles per hour. It followed. 65 miles per hour. It followed. Once we reached a magical 80 miles per hour in his beat-up Toyota. The creature was no longer visible in the rear-view mirror. The driver chuckled in a drunken fashion and said, "Ha, skinwalkers and tourists who come here say it's just folklore." Story 4. Karetnikov Pass. I need to preface this by saying that I have looked everywhere for any evidence of the existence of Karetnikov Pass, and couldn't find anything. I know it's real, and I know what I saw, but it's like any evidence of it was erased from existence. I needed some time away from real life for a bit, so I decided to go camping. Finding an appropriate site that wasn't already too popular, or ruined by other campers who mistreated the beauty of nature was difficult. I went down a long list of 4- and 5-star campsites on Google Maps, and none of them really fit all my criteria. Until I came across one 4-star rating with only a handful of reviews. It barely had any interaction, but I looked up pictures of it, and it was gorgeous. This dusty green mountain with some of the most pleasant viewpoints. Notably, it overlooked a lake and what looked like a small, Victorian Gothic town. While I was browsing photos of the mountain, I found a few articles about mysterious disappearances and supposed supernatural sightings, and an article about a civil war that had taken place in 1913. Now, I'm an avid horror and history fan, so I wasn't as put off by this as I probably should have been. In fact, the opposite was true. I was intrigued by it all. I figured I could stop by the town on my way to the pass, and ask around about their history. To save time, I won't go into too many details about the weeks leading up to the camp. It's pretty much all you'd expect from some artist's daily life. Nothing of note really happened. The first notable instant was on my drive to Karetnikov Pass. I had been driving for almost 3 hours. The radio clock ticked just past 21:30. I don't know exactly where I was, but it was somewhere along Route 2A. I do know I was nearing the dirt road that lead to the town under the mountain. A few hundred feet away from said turn, I could swear I saw a girl in a white dress. It seemed like she was hitchhiking. Now, I pride myself on being a good Samaritan, so I pulled over to offer her a ride. As I did so, however, my phone pinged. So I pulled to a stop and checked the notification. It was a text from an unknown number that simply read, "I'm sorry." I brushed it off and looked back up, and the girl had vanished. Okay, weird, but I'd been awake all day and it was getting late, so I just wrote it off, even with a little voice at the back of my head trying to tell me it had something to do with a nearby town. I pulled off into the dirt road and made my way towards the town. Again, nothing of note for most of that drive, which only took a few minutes. After a while, I turned the corner that led onto an old, grimy-looking tar road. It had a large askew sign nailed to a tree next to the road. It read, "Population 6." The only clear number was the 6. The rest had been scratched out, or faded over time. I followed the tar road into what was clearly an abandoned town. Empty streets filled with cracks and potholes, broken windows and decayed wooden doors. A ghost of a once beautiful town. There went my hopes of talking to people about it, but such is the way with time, right? I stopped at a gas station at the edge of town to have dinner. I stepped out of the car to stretch my legs, and just sort of wandered around the gas station taking in the sights. Admittedly, not much, but I was fascinated by the feeling of such liminal spaces. On the wall right next to the broken-down door, there was a sign with a list of rules, which seemed a little out of place. Why would the laws be on a random gas station the edge of town? I figured it was a small town and probably one of the few places that had a local sheriff enforcing the laws, and they were likely littered around town. The place was rather out of the way, after all. I'll transcribe the rules here, since they seemed odd. even for a small, out-of-the-way town. Curfew is from 9 p.m. until 8 a.m. Everything excluding emergency services are to be closed.
No exceptions.
Emergency services are advised to lock their doors and cooperate with local law enforcement in case of emergencies. If any citizen is found in the streets after curfew, they will be placed under arrest for the remainder of the night. If you encounter anyone other than local law enforcement during curfew, do not engage. Keep all your doors and windows locked during curfew.
No exceptions.
Do not answer your door during curfew. Do not pay attention to anyone claiming to be in need of help, or even a family member who claims to have lost their key. If any of your relatives or loved ones are not home by curfew, inform local law enforcement via telephone. If you cannot make it to your home in time for curfew, remain inside your vehicle or call local law enforcement. If you cannot do the above, remain where you are. You will be found and taken into custody by local law enforcement. Do not swim in the lake near the mountain. Do not go into the mountain during curfew. Do not leave town during curfew. Some of these rules seemed very strange to me, but then again, the town had supposedly been haunted, so I chalked it up to paranoia. I got back in my car and unwrapped a box of fries and a burger I had on the passenger seat. While I was eating, I heard a knock on my car window. I looked up to see what seemed to be a homeless man. He had oily, scraggly hair and a beard that looked like it had been shaven in random patches. He wore a brown jacket, a white shirt and a light blue denim. I rolled down my window slightly and asked him what he wanted. He said he was hungry and had been walking for hours, and asked if I could share some of my meal. I did so, offering him the remainder of the fries in the box. He thanked me, and I told him to hold on a moment. I took a few $10 bills out of my wallet to help him out, but when I had looked back up, he was gone. I stepped out of the car again and looked around to see if I could catch him before he ran off, but there was no sign of him in the parking lot, or anywhere on the nearby road. I thought he might have been living in the gas station or nearby, so I went looking inside. I found a bunch of old, empty shelves, a rusted image of a once lively place. The door to the storage area was locked, and I am not the person with the type of strength to break it down. There was also no sign of a key anywhere. I thought the homeless man probably had the key, and headed back to my car. Still, I felt uneasy about the interaction. As I've mentioned before, the town was rather small, and I felt the need to get a little exercise. I always enjoyed the night time, so I grabbed my gear and started the hike towards the mountain. Along the way, I found the girl I'd seen on the highway again. She asked me for something to drink, and I gave her my canteen, figuring I could probably refill it at the lake. She drank the remainder of the water and thanked me. I nodded to her as she handed the canteen back, and went on my way. She stared at me for a little while as I kept walking, but I just smiled politely and continued. When I looked back after walking about a street, she had been gone. She must have walked the other direction. The buildings were pretty in the way, so you couldn't exactly see if someone had turned a corner. I kept walking, finding my way through the maze of buildings and towards the lake at the base of the mountain, just at the other edge of town. As I knelt down next to it to refill my canteen, I heard a woman with the most angelic voice I had ever heard singing the sound of silence. I wondered if it was the woman, but the singing was coming from a direction across the lake that would be pretty hard to access, so I just made a mental note of it, refilled my canteen, and walked to the edge of the nearby dirt road going into the cliffs between the mountain. During my hike through the pass, I heard laughing from the edges of the cliffs around me. It was creepy, but it almost sounded like hyenas, so I just went about my way, trying to ignore it. I checked the time on my phone and was surprised at how much time had passed. It was already almost 1 a.m. I decided to set up camp a little further into the pass and sleep the rest of the night. Luckily, sleep came easily that night, and I was out probably by 2 a.m. However, I had the strangest dream that night. I was walking through a forest, and a man in a sheep mask was stalking me through the trees. I knew he was there, I think he knew I knew, and was proud of the fact. He kept cackling, laughing like a hyena, and then he set the trees on fire. By itself, that's just a random nightmare. I've had a habit of getting those, but I awoke to the smell of smoke, and quickly noticed my tent was on fire. I jumped out of it as soon as I could and went to put out the fire. Only, before I could, he was there, the man in the lamb's mask, tilting his head in the most unnatural way and laughing at me. And then he lunged. I left everything there and then, and booked it. I ran through the town for what felt like hours, back to my car. He was on my heels the whole time, laughing the night away. I finally made it to my car, heaving and out of breath. I had no idea how I covered that much ground without collapsing, but I did. I quickly got in and locked the doors. Just my luck though, the car wouldn't start. That creep made it to the car, and knocked on my window, whistling in the most eerie tone I had ever heard, all while canting his head to and fro. I ignored him and kept trying to start the car, and I succeeded just as he smashed his elbow through my window. The glass had hit me and cut me in several places. I tried to ignore the blood and pain, and floored it out of the parking lot. He hung on for a little while, but I was able to get rid of him by driving a little too close to the tree at the edge of the road out of town. Near the turn to the highway, the homeless man stood in the middle of the road, arms held wide open like he was inviting me to hit him. I didn't want to stop. I couldn't. I don't know what came over me, but I hit the gas and ran straight into him. There was a loud thud when I did, but when I looked into the rearview mirror, there was no body, no man, nothing. I kept going. I turned on the highway, and right there had been the girl in white, hitchhiking. My phone pinged and I ignored it, speeding down the highway. When I felt like I had gotten far enough away, I stopped and checked my phone. One new notification. A text from an unknown number.
I'm sorry.
I went home and tried to forget the whole incident. Out of curiosity, though, I recently looked up Karetnikov Pass and found nothing. Story 5. The Orphan Train. Every town has its urban legends, stories that are passed down generation after generation, stories about phantom hitchhikers, unexplained disappearances, or haunted cemeteries. My hometown is no different, except that our urban legend is real. The story of the orphan train began in 1907. On October 9th, a train full of homeless children from New York was supposed to arrive in our town. It was part of some program to place orphans with families throughout the Midwest. It never arrived. Instead, a few miles outside of town, in the early hours of the morning, the train derailed and caught fire, killing everyone on board. That's where the facts end and the myth begins. According to legend, every October 9th the orphan train reappears, filled with the restless spirits of the dead and trying to complete a journey that will never end. There isn't much more to the legend than that. It was the sort of story you told to your friends at a sleepover, and everyone knew of someone who had claimed to have seen the train. There were even a few unsuccessful attempts to build a tourist industry around it. Still, no one in town actually believed all the stories. No one, that is, except for Ben Whitaker. Ben was my best friend. We'd known each other since kindergarten and were inseparable during our childhood. He was also the school's resident weird kid, always carrying around books about ghosts and haunted places. I had similar interests, but for me, it was just a phase. For Ben, it was something more. You see, Ben's parents had died in a car accident when he was about 5 years old. He'd been raised by an aunt and uncle who meant well, but they could never quite fill the void left by his parents' death. Ben would never admit it, but that was when his obsession with the supernatural began. He didn't just want proof that there was something beyond death. He needed it. Of course. Growing up, I didn't understand that. Ben was just my friend who was a little weird. Sure, his obsession with the paranormal was annoying, but I thought it was harmless. And it was, at least until senior year of high school. Ben had been pestering me about going out to see the train since we'd learned to drive. Every year, starting around August, he'd plead with me to go out with him and prove that the legend was true. I'd shot him down every time, but this year he was more persistent than usual. This was going to be our last chance, he warned me. After graduation, we were going to move away and never come back. If we didn't go out there this October, we would never see it. He was wrong on both counts, but I had no way of knowing it at the time, so I agreed. On October 8th, just before midnight, we took my parents' car and drove out to the stretch of tracks where the orphan train supposedly appeared. We parked in front of an abandoned gas station and walked the rest of the way. The only thing standing between us and the railroad tracks was an easily hopped fence. "We're not going to get hit by a train, are we?" I asked Ben as we walked up to the tracks. "Nah, we'll be fine. I don't think any trains use this track anymore." With that, all we could do was wait. The hours ticked by, with only the mosquitoes and crickets to keep us company. I suffered through it because I thought I knew how much this meant to him. But after hours of mosquito bites and no ghost train to show for it, my patience was at its end. "Ben, it's almost 3. Nothing is going to show up. If one of my parents wakes up and finds me gone, I'm not driving the car again until I'm 30. So let's go." Ben turned to protest. But then the ground began to shake. Up ahead a bright light emerged from the darkness and began heading towards us. The roar of an oncoming train drowned out the drone of the woods. "This is it," Ben whispered, taking a step towards the tracks. "Ben." "This is it," he repeated, stepping closer. "Ben, we need Dash." "Shut up. I need to see it," he whispered, now standing dangerously close to the tracks. The roar of the passing train was deafening as I reached forward and yanked Ben back. A second later, a very real, very solid train flew past us. There were no ghostly children on board, only rusting cargo containers. Ben's face fell as the last car went by. I thought, Dash, you thought wrong. Now come on. We're leaving." Ben nodded and followed me back to the car. We drove home in silence, and Ben never brought up the orphan train to me again. Looking back, that was the night Ben and I began to drift apart. Ben withdrew into himself, and I was too busy making post-graduation plans to try and draw him back out. Then I moved away to college. Ben stayed put, claimed he was still trying to figure things out. We tried to keep in touch, but Ben fell off my radar, especially once I moved away to St. Louis for work. I thought about Ben on and off over the next 20 years, but I could never find the time to try and get back in touch with him. Then last year my mother had a bad fall and needed someone to look after her until she recovered. So I packed my things and headed back to my hometown for an extended stay. I was bringing in the mail one day, and nestled between the bills was a get well card from the Whitakers. That was nice of them. I should send them something back. Things have been hard for them since they lost their boy, she sighed, setting the card on her nightstand. Their boy. I thought they only had daughters. She shook her head and said that she was talking about the boy they took in. Their nephew. Ben. What happened to Ben? I asked, and her face fell. That was how I learned that Ben Whitaker had been dead for almost a year. He'd died up near the old train tracks in early October. My mother didn't know much more than that the police had ruled it an accident. It's hard to process the death of someone you haven't heard from in years. It hits you as hard as any other death, but you're not really sad for the person that died. You're sad for the person they used to be. the person frozen in your memories. Then you start to think of all the times you were going to reconnect with them, only to put it off until it was too late. Still, what I felt more than grief or guilt was anger. I knew exactly when Ben had died and where. He had still been chasing ghosts right up until the end, and this time it had cost him more than a childhood friendship. Or maybe it hadn't been an accident at all, and that thought made me even angrier. Why hadn't he gotten help instead of clinging to his delusions? I was in a bad place, and staying cooped up inside the house wasn't helping. So that night I hopped in my car and drove out to the local dive bar. It was the early hours of October 9th when I stumbled out of the bar and made my way to my car. I didn't intend to drive out to the tracks, but I still wasn't surprised when that's where I ended up. I staggered out of my car and toward the tracks. The old gas station was rubble now, and the only reminder of the fence was a few rusted poles jutting out of the ground. I stumbled past them and came to a halt next to the tracks. Looking them over, I had to wonder why they were even still here. Not like they were doing anyone any good, all rusted over and half buried in the dirt. They should have been torn up years ago. It took me a few moments for my mind to fully register those thoughts. No train had run on these tracks in at least a decade. Whatever had happened to Ben out here, it hadn't involved a train. My mind was still struggling to process what this meant when I heard the train whistle. It was a shrill sound that pounded into my skull like a jackhammer. I turned to the source of the noise, and I screamed. You see, hearing a legend is one thing, but seeing it is something else. I thought I knew the story of the orphan train, but I didn't know the half of it. I didn't know that the train was bent and broken, still bearing the scars of the accident, or that the children inside were just as broken and stared out, not in fear or anger, but in resignation. I didn't know about the stench of burning coal and flesh that the train carried with it, and I wish to God I still didn't know about the screaming face of Ben Whitaker, pressed against the glass and begging to be let off a train that will never reach its destination. Story 6. I got trapped on an endless road, and when I escaped, something followed me home. To start off this story, I had been looking forward to this road trip for weeks. It was my chance to celebrate my college graduation with my family at our vacation home, and I couldn't wait to spend some quality time with them. But as I drove down the winding roads, I began to realize that something was wrong. The road seemed to go on forever, with no end in sight. I tried to turn around, but every time I did, I ended up right back where I started. I was getting more and more anxious by the minute, and then I saw a figure on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just a hitchhiker, but something about the way they were standing made me feel uneasy. I decided to pass them since I was a small girl, and the thought of a random man in my car made me uncomfortable. But then, 2 minutes later, I saw them again. Their face seemed to be misplaced, like it had been twisted out of shape. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just my imagination. But every time I passed the figure, their body contorted slightly, becoming more and more twisted until they looked like something out of a horror film. I started to drive faster, going about 120 miles per hour, desperate to get away from the figure. But no matter how fast I drove, it was always there, standing on the side of the road. Every 30 seconds, I passed them again, and every time, their body was even more twisted and deformed than before. I was starting to lose it. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I tried to call my family, but my phone had no signal. I was completely alone, trapped in this endless loop with this twisted figure haunting me at every turn. And then, all of a sudden, the figure was gone. I let out a sigh of relief, thinking that it was finally over. But then I heard a slight gurgling noise behind me, and when I looked in my rearview mirror, I saw the figure sitting in the seat behind me. I screamed and tried to swerve off the road, but the figure held me in place, its twisted face just inches from mine. It whispered something in a language I couldn't understand, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was back on the road, driving towards our vacation home. I thought it had all been a nightmare, but then I saw something in the corner of my eye. It was the figure, standing on the side of the road once again. I knew then that I was trapped in some kind of loop, doomed to repeat this terrifying experience over and over again. I tried to think of a way out, but the road just kept stretching out before me, with no end in sight. As I passed the figure once again, I saw its body contort and twist, becoming more and more monstrous with each passing moment. I knew then that I had to get out of this loop before it was too late. I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal and sped away, driving faster than I ever had before. I passed the figure again and again, each time its twisted form growing more and more grotesque. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the figure disappeared, and I heard nothing but silence. I slowed down, cautiously looking around for any sign of the figure, but there was nothing. I let out a sigh of relief, thinking that it was finally over. But then I saw something in my rearview mirror, and my heart dropped. The figure was sitting in the seat behind me once again, its twisted face grinning menacingly. I screamed and slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The figure reached out and grabbed my shoulder, its grip tight and cold. I could feel its breath on my neck, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. "Welcome back." It felt like it was speaking from inside of my own head. "We have much to show you." And then everything went black again. When I woke up, I was back on the road once again, driving towards the vacation home. But this time, I knew that it was different. This time, I was ready. I drove faster than before, passing the figure every 30 seconds, watching as it contorted and twisted into grotesque shapes. But this time, I didn't let it get to me. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, refusing to let the figure distract me. And then, when the figure disappeared, I slowed down, cautiously looking around for any sign of it. But there was nothing. The road stretched out before me, endless and empty. I let out a sigh of relief, feeling a sense of triumph that I had broken free from the loop. But then I heard something in the back seat, a slight gurgling noise. I turned around slowly, bracing myself for the worst. But what I saw was not the twisted figure, but a small child, crying and alone. "Please help me," the child whimpered, tears streaming down their face. I felt a pang of sympathy for the child, and I pulled over to the side of the road. But as soon as I opened the door, the child's face twisted and contorted, becoming that of the twisted figure. I screamed and slammed the door shut, driving away as fast as I could. But the figure was there, chasing me down the endless road, its twisted form growing more and more monstrous with each passing moment. I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up. But then, in the distance, I saw a glimmer of light, a beacon of hope in the darkness. I drove towards it, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, I saw that it was the vacation home, and my family waiting outside. I pulled up to the house, my hands shaking on the wheel. I got out of the car, stumbling towards my family, tears streaming down my face. They looked at me with concern, asking what was wrong. But I couldn't explain it to them, couldn't put into words the terror that I had just experienced. All I knew was that I had broken free from the loop, that I had escaped the twisted figure and found my way home. And for that, I was grateful. Update. It's been 2 days since I escaped the loop and arrived at the vacation home, and something seems off about my family. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But now I'm starting to believe that my family isn't really my family. They act strange when they think I'm not looking. Sometimes they whisper to each other in some unknown language that I've never heard before. And when I ask them what they're talking about, they just give me a blank stare as if they don't understand me. What's more unsettling is that they don't remember any of the childhood memories that we shared. It's as if those moments never existed. I brought up the time we went to the beach when I was 10, but they looked at me as if I were crazy. It's like they're trying to erase any trace of my past. I can't shake the feeling that my family is not who they say they are. The more I think about it, the more I'm convinced that they are beings from the loop. The loop must have created them to keep me trapped and prevent me from leaving. I constantly feel like I'm being watched. I feel as if this isn't reality. Do I have some psychotic disorder? Am I crazy? I am confused and scared. Story 7. If you see two kids on Highway 101, don't stop. The 101 is just a trickle by the time it winds north of Forks. Much of it does not have cell coverage, and in the middle of the night, the darkness is so pervasive that it only steps back a little from the high beams. It seems darkest that most near mile post 199. Tail light reflectors shined through the rolling 2 a.m. fog. A car was there, an old dusty 1980s station wagon driven through the wider part of hell. The windows were all dusted over despite a heavy downpour 10 minutes ago. It appears it was in a crash that forced the driver's door open along with the hood. Standing by the car were two kids not more than 10, the son in a yellow Hulkamatic tee and the girl in a pink pastel shirt and under jean overalls. The girl, maybe a bit older, waved to get my attention. I leaned over and rolled down the window a just crack. I learned the hard way to never trust strangers. "Our car's broken, mister," the girl said as her brother began to cry. "Our parents were picked up by a hitchhiker and we haven't seen them all day. You gotta help us, mister." "Hold on. First, what are your names?" The way their eyes gazed back at me reminded me of dead fish on the market. The son, crying moments before, now spoke boldly to me. "Our parents are missing. You got to let us into your car." There was an uneasy energy to the boy. "He didn't blink when you were speaking to him. I can stay here and watch over you. Just let us into your car, please, mister," the sister said as she tugged at the old-fashioned handle of my car. Both seemed to wonder why the hell I wasn't complying. There is no reason for anyone to enter or exit my car. The son tried for the back door and would have pulled it open if I didn't slam down the thumb lock, and doing the same for the others. I have been in road jumps before. Just because I saw two kids now did not mean others were hiding elsewhere, especially in the woods. The sister began to cry and pound on the window. "You gotta let us in," we heard growling, "and we can't shut our door after the crash. They're bears. They're gonna get in and eat us. You gotta let us in. If there is a bear, I will handle it." The boy yanked on the same back passenger side door. "We haven't eaten or drank anything all day." I held up an evidence bag of cherry tomatoes and 2 bottles of distilled water. They just stared blankly at me, as if doing their best to hide their annoyance. "Are you allergic? Do you want just the water?" "Nothing." I shifted gears. "Were you stranded all day?" No answer. "If you were, you would have been caught in that rain shower. Your vehicle is dusty. Where did you drive from?" "Just let us into your car, mister," the girl said again. "Hide the Tina Turner packed cassette player and bulky headphones. You like retro stuff? I haven't seen a working cassette in years. Where are you guys from?" The boy slowly beat his small fist on the glass in woe. "You are not supposed to ask us questions. You are supposed to help us." "Help us, Howard." The girl's voice dropped an octave, as did her brother's. "Yes. Help us, Moxley. Do the right thing for once in your miserable life." Something in the car moved, and I let off the brake. They let go as soon as my car lurched forward. I drove away calmly. They didn't attempt to follow me. I stopped a passing pickup 5 miles up the road and told him about what I saw and warned him not to stop, that nothing looked right or natural about the children or the situation. The man and his wife gave me the look you would give someone who wants you to give a personal message to JFK. They nodded their heads, said thank you, and drove on. I waited by the side of the road until they left before tailing them. Eventually, I saw the two vehicles meet and kept back in the darkness a few hundred feet. The husband exited the vehicle to see the damage. What happened in the dark and was extremely fast. I will do my best to describe a process that took no more than 15 seconds. The girl jumped into the vehicle and pulled the door closed. A moment later, she erupted into a gelatin foam that busted out the windows of the truck and completely devoured the vehicle in seconds. The husband turned and witnessed his wife get trapped just as the sun tackled the man's legs and erupted into a ball of foam himself, knocking the man into the station wagon that had already began to soften like butter in a hot room. The masses came together and then compressed, containing the erupting tanks and bursting tires in dull puffs. The colorless form coalesced into an exact copy of the pickup truck the couple was driving, for bodies formed behind the dash. Then headlights. The copies looked at me as they passed. The children were in the back, smiling and waving goodbye in unison. The lures I'm sure the car will use again. I turned around to pursue them when I spun out and crashed in a way that forced my driver door open. I could not stop them. Neither can you. So if you see two kids on 101, call the cops, send help, but do not stop.